as World War I was getting underway and some of the most brutal battles in all of world history were now taking place, a French captain by the name of Charles de Gaulle said that all the courage in the world cannot prevail against gunfire. And this would kind of be one of the themes of World War I, at least as I see it. This idea of huge masses of men being thrown against these new 20th century weapons like machine guns and artillery, and this kind of general feel of hopelessness. And it's not just the tragedy of the war, it's all of the things that World War I impacted after the war, and all of the horrible things that World War I would kind of generate in the future. So obviously one of the big questions is, could things have turned out differently? And I think one of the themes of just taking 1914 as just a singular year in the war is, should Germany have won the war in 1914? Could things have turned out differently? Or could Germany have at least done enough to be in a strong position to negotiate something that would be a beneficial outcome for them in comparison to what happened? It's questions like this that interest me more than kind of a chronological day-by-day account of the war with all of the details and stuff like that. So I think this episode will be more of a series of questions and themes for each year of the war and all the different possibilities that could play out and kind of the questions of humanity that are involved in it. So I think there's plenty of books and other podcasts that can take you through the day-to-day, and I think that's a great place to go. Here in this episode, I'm more interested in the themes, the questions, and kind of the highlights that I feel need to be accented for the year of 1914. Really, the first theme that I really thought about when I was kind of doing this research for 1914 was, could World War I have turned out differently? Is it possible that Germany could have even won the war? Or maybe could it have been the quick war that a lot of people thought it was going to be? I think that to answer this question, one thing you really need to look at is the leadership of all sides in this war, and specifically some of the poor leadership. So historians have been critical of the leaders, not just of the military, kind of, the generals and the people in leadership positions there, but also the political leaders. Let's take Germany, for example. So you have to start with Kaiser Wilhelm II. He's kind of like the Emperor of Germany, the most powerful man in the system, and when you read more about him, you kind of get this image of a childish boy king. So if anyone's seen Game of Thrones, what reminds me the most of Kaiser Wilhelm is this image of kind of a childish King Joffrey kind of running around, not really understanding the way that war works, and he's always trying to kind of get his way, and he just seems very much like more of an annoyance to the real people in charge than anything else. But the problem is when the leader of your society is more of an annoyance than a help, that's going to trickle down and that's going to impact everybody in the system. Just as an example here, the head of the German military in 1914 is a guy by the name of von Moltke, at least at the start of the war, and he often gets criticized for not going to the front enough and actually kind of visiting in with the soldiers and getting a sense from his different commanders of what's going on the ground level. And by the way, this is something that the French leadership in 1914 kind of gets credit for. The French leader was a guy by the name of Joseph Joffre, who we'll talk about, and he often kind of is seen as the soldier's general. He's often visiting, shaking hands with people, kind of playing politician, this type of thing. The problem for von Moltke, though, was that he was actually afraid that if he left the Kaiser alone for too long, that the Kaiser would try to basically go Rambo and take personal command of the situation and do something just horribly disastrous. So that kind of seems crazy, but he had a legitimate fear that the Kaiser was going to, if he wasn't basically babysat enough, he was going to do something stupid and maybe single-handedly lose the war. Later on in 1914, as things were kind of grinding to a halt, Kaiser Wilhelm would be demanding a victory parade and kind of wanting to show off the military and parade through these conquered cities, and the German military leadership is just kind of annoyed by this constant egotistical demand for parades and victories. It is a little bit amazing how these egotistical figures can surface and resurface on the world stage from time to time. So that's the Kaiser, and I think you can imagine how that sort of attitude and general leadership style could negatively impact the overall war effort for Germany. So you can imagine if there was someone in place a little bit more reasonable and capable, the war might have gone differently. Now, as far as the German military leadership, the leader of the war effort in 1914, like I said, was a guy by the name of Moltke, and he takes a lot of heat. So we talked about something called the Schlieffen Plan in the last episode, and it was kind of Germany's big plan to win the war, which we'll go into in a second here, but spoiler alert, it didn't work. So he takes a lot of heat for not adhering to the plan maybe as much as he should have. I think that sometimes he's seen as a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit indecisive, and this is kind of, the knock against him. The rest of the German generals and commanders are seen as more capable, some more than others. But what I do think you see is kind of this idea of old versus new. So I think throughout the German military, there's kind of this conflict between the old sort of Prussian ways of doing things and the new ideas of modern warfare. I think what you have to understand is that most of the guys at the top of the German military are from a class of people called the Junkers. Now, these guys come from East Germany or East Prussia, whatever you want to call it, and it's kind of like wealthy landowners who have, been passed down in the family from generation to generation, and they have a very old school mentality about them, sort of a mentality going back to Otto von Bismarck and the way he kind of implemented the military into society. I don't want to spend too much time going over that. I think I did that in the episode where I talked about the rise of the Nazis. I gave a little background on Bismarck, so if you're interested in that, you can go check that out. I think that's somewhere in the beginning of episode 20, if you're interested. And the conflict is really, how can you have this old Bismarckian style of state leadership, and how can you adopt it and change it to modern industry and the modern needs of kind of total war, and mix this all with liberalism? And how can you do all that without falling apart as a state? Ultimately, I don't think they were able to do that, and that's one of the big conflicts of the war. Here's historian G.J. Meyer talking about this conflict. Quote, "Just as for a good junker, the only thoroughly acceptable army officer was an East Prussian of acceptable family background, so too the only dependable recruit was an ignorant and docile East Prussian farm boy. The increasing numbers of alternatives, growing hordes of city dwellers and factory workers, many of them infected with modern notions, were aliens and not to be trusted." End quote. So again, it's kind of this sense of the old and the new mixing together. I think, for example, you look at a guy like Falkenhayn, who would kind of take over the German army at the end of 1914. He would be kind of a more old school junker guy. And then Ludendorff, who will become more important as the war goes on, he's more of this modern total war kind of guy. So I think that's kind of what the German generals were dealing with. Now, the French, on the other hand, were arguably a little bit more cohesive to start the war, but they were kind of infected with this notion, and it was called the cult of the offensive. Historians have really described it as a cult. So if you were not indoctrinated into this belief system that going on the offensive is the way to win the war, no matter what, and it doesn't necessarily matter what defensive formations your enemy are in or what condition your army is in. If you're not going on the offensive, as a French leader in the military, you would find yourself not taken seriously. And almost all of the French generals and French leadership in the war would be heavily influenced by this idea in the beginning of the war. Again, the idea was it doesn't matter where your enemy is or what he's doing. As long as you're on the attack, you're going to be in good shape to win the next battle and the war overall. Let's take a look at one of these military guys who was promoting this ideologies as he lectured the French Supreme War Council. Quote, "For the attack, only two things are necessary: to know where the enemy is and to decide what to do. What the enemy intends to do is of no consequence." End quote. So there is a tradition and a scholarship behind this ideology that goes back for a long time, but I think it's obvious to say that for us today, this seems ridiculous. Not caring what your enemy is doing or thinking or formulating and continuing to order hopeless attack after hopeless attack was dangerous and deadly for hundreds of thousands of French soldiers in the first year of the war. That takes care of the Germans and the French. Now, if the Germans were divided and the French were delusional, then it seems like the British were disengaged. What I mean by that is that it doesn't seem like the British generals and the guys in charge really had their priorities straight as far as what they needed to do to actually win this war, at least not to start in 1914. The leader of the British military on the continent was a guy by the name of John French. And here's how historian G.J. Meyer describes him, quote, "In the art of generalship, French was rarely better than ordinary. An ability to identify and make use of the best available men was not among his talents, and no knowledgeable observer would credit him with displaying or raising the forces under his command to impressive levels of efficiency." End quote. Not exactly a stirring review of his ability there. And here's G.J. Meyer again discussing the priorities of the leaders in the British Army. Quote, "As gentlemen, they adhered to a code that elevated amateurism in all things to a supreme virtue. Hunting, shooting, polo, and weekend gatherings at country estates were proper activities. Too much seriousness, for example, too much reading, even about military history and strategy, definitely was not. The kinds of disputes over theory that racked the French officer corps were unimaginable north of the Channel, where nobody in uniform cared about theories." End quote. So he's kind of describing this almost boys' club, almost like a fraternity here, where it's more about meeting and greeting and doing these activities together and kind of being a man than it is about learning actual military doctrine or strategy. John French's subordinate was a guy by the name of Haig, and if you want to know about the disengagement of the British as far as military planning and strategy had been going and the direction things were moving, just listen to a quote of his. Here it is. Quote, "The role of cavalry on the battlefield will always go on increasing." And another one here, "Artillery only seems likely to be effective against raw troops." End quote. You don't have to be an expert in World War I to figure out how stupid those comments are. So maybe if the British generals spent more time researching and reading and caring about military strategy, they could have helped much more and maybe turn the tides of the war a little bit more in the first year. John French and Haig and a couple others were kind of the leaders on the continent, but they were also kind of subordinates to a guy by the name of Kitchener, who is kind of like a politician, kind of like a Secretary of Defense type, and he's telling French what to do. French doesn't want to do things that way, and he's telling Kitchener different things, and it just seems like all of these generals were a little bit paranoid, and they're trying to undermine each other, and even, your superior or even your subordinate, everyone was kind of paranoid of being removed from this gentleman's club. It just seemed to be more about politics than actual realities on the ground. And that goes for all the generals, really on all sides. There is this element of a lot of these guys being paranoid of others and trying to maintain their power positions, and it's almost sad to read about. I hope that gives you a better sense of the leadership deficiencies, at least in the three main armies to start things off in 1914. Of course, it's true that nobody is perfect, and a lot of these guys are doing the best they can, but I also don't think it's unreasonable to say that if you could do it over again, a lot of these countries probably would want better leadership at the helm. The next theme that really becomes apparent when you look at 1914 is the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany's plan for mobilizing for the war and really for winning the war was called the Schlieffen Plan. It's something we talked about a little bit in the last episode. It's obviously a little bit more complicated than this, but the idea was to mass a huge number of troops on the right side of their line. So this would be the section of the army that rolls through Belgium, which the German army did for the most part, and then they were just going to keep rolling through northeastern France until eventually they made their way to Paris. And part of the plan was kind of have one army go around Paris and then kind of engage in this encirclement or pincer movement, which the German army loves to try and do. So instead of having a evenly spread out army advancing into France, the initial plan was kind of just hold the line on the left, not use too many troops, and then put as many as you can on the right side and just bring it down like an anvil on the French troops. I think the Germans knew that they were going to be at a manpower disadvantage when you consider the fact that they're going against the Russians in the east and they have to at least hold them off a little bit. They're going against the French and the British, so if they could kind of manufacture a small area where they had the manpower advantage, then maybe that could be a key to the war. So I think that right side of the army where they could build up this big manpower advantage, and the idea was kind of just bring it down on the French. I think it does kind of connect a little bit to this idea of the cult of the offensive. To me, I kind of see it a little bit like an analogy to professional sports, maybe the NFL or the NBA, where a lot of times it's the flashy offensive guys who get hired as head coaches. And in a lot of ways, the Schlieffen Plan was kind of a flashy offensive move, kind of this big, risky move that was going to lead to a very quick war rather than something more defensive that might be better for the long haul. Invading through Belgium, for example, would be the quickest way to get into the French defenses and really kind of bring this Schlieffen big right side of the army onto the French. But in the long haul, it was going to upset the British, and they would use this as the main excuse for them to get into the war, and it would upset the United States enough where now kind of the trajectory of public opinion starts to shift from being neutral to slowly starting to get more involved in the war. Obviously, there's a ton of other factors there, and some people don't even think that the traditional reasons that the United States got in the war, at least the traditional reasons why people say the United States got in the war, are even true, but that comes later. To continue the analogy of the Schlieffen Plan being compared to kind of this professional sports thing, to me, I kind of see it like a game plan. So a football team creates a game plan before the game, and that's the plan that they're going to go with to start the game. And unfortunately, sometimes you make mistakes and you turn the ball over and you have penalties and you throw interceptions, and sometimes the other team just outplays you for a play or a series or whatever the case may be. So when that happens, you have to adjust the game plan. If your game plan was to go into the football game and try and run the ball and the other team is stuffing you, you're going to have to start throwing the ball. So this is what the German general von Moltke kind of did. He saw the Schlieffen Plan as something that he went in with a game plan as, but he needed to adjust it based on things that were happening in the war. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And Moltke gets a lot of criticism for adjusting the Schlieffen Plan when he might not have necessarily had to. Here's historian Barbara Tuchman talking about that, quote, "Mentally, Moltke had opened his mind to an alternative strategy dependent on what the enemy would do. The passionate simplicity of Schlieffen's design for total effort by one wing and rigid cleaving to the plan regardless of enemy movements was broken. The plan that had appeared so faultless on paper cracked under pressure of the uncertainties, above all the emotions of war. Having deprived himself of the comfort of a prearranged strategy, Moltke was thereafter tormented by indecisiveness whenever a decision was required." End quote. Essentially what happens is that the Germans start the war very well, and the Schlieffen Plan appears to be working. Their army is forcing the French and the British back further and further and further, and the Germans are advancing further and further into France from the right side of their line, and they get into a position where they're actually very close to their objective. They're very close to Paris. And Moltke takes a lot of heat because he took 2 whole corps of the German right wing and he sent them over to the Eastern Front. The reason he did this was because he thought that they were needed over there. But because of a miscommunication, they actually weren't needed. And it was seen as kind of a wasteful and sheepish move by Moltke. He also moved some troops over from his right to his left and probably attacked a little bit too much on the left side because that was something that the Schlieffen Plan didn't really call for. And when it came down to the decisive, we call it the Battle of the Marne, there weren't enough troops there from the German perspective to basically hold the ground and kind of win there. So Moltke takes a lot of heat for that, moving those troops. But I think it is important to give credit to the French and the British for organizing a resistance that came to be known as the Battle of the Marne. So the Germans are pushing in further and further into France, and the French actually kind of secretly move a whole bunch of troops over to their left side to kind of combat this huge German right wing. And due to some miscommunications on the German side and some determined fighting on the French side, the left side of the French is able to kind of turn the tides. A gap appears between 2 of the German armies, and the French are able to exploit it, and the German right side basically has to retreat a little bit, otherwise they would get pretty badly beaten. And once that retreat happens, the Schlieffen Plan is kind of over, and we kind of get settled into 3-4 more years of trench warfare. Here's historian Barbara Tuchman kind of throwing some of that blame on Moltke. She's going to describe some of the German generals in charge of the right side, so those are the names if you don't recognize them. Quote, "If the Germans had not withdrawn 2 corps to send against the Russians, one of the 2 would have been on Bülow's right and might have filled the gap between him and Kluck. The other would have been with Hausen and might have provided the extra strength to overwhelm Foch." End quote. I'm trying not to get too into the names of all the specific armies and generals and all that stuff because it gets a little confusing, but the basic idea is if they didn't send those troops over to Russia, they would have had enough troops on the right, like they were supposed to have all along, to withstand any counterattack or movements of armies that the French made. Whether or not those troops actually would have made the difference, so would it have made a difference if Moltke didn't move those troops from the right flank all the way over to Russia? Whether or not those movements of troops would have made a difference is up for debate. Some historians think, yes, that's the key here, but other people think, look, that army was tired anyway, and they might not have made it to Paris even if they wanted to. So listen to the leader of the right side of the German army talking about his soldiers being worn out on September 2nd, about a month into the war. Quote, "For 4 days they have been marching 40 kilometers a day. The ground is difficult, the roads are torn up, trees felled, the fields pitted by shells like strainers. The soldiers stagger at every step. Their faces are plastered with dust, their uniforms are in rags, one might call them living ragbags. They march with closed eyes and sing in chorus to keep from falling asleep as they march. The certainty of victory close at hand and of their triumphal entry into Paris sustains them and whips up their enthusiasm. Without this certainty of victory, they would fall exhausted. They would lie down where they are to sleep at last, no matter where, no matter how. And to give their bodies a drunkenness like that of their souls, they drink enormously. But this drunkenness also helps to keep them up. Today, after an inspection, the general was furiously angry. He wanted to put an end to this collective debauch. We have just persuaded him not to give severe orders. It is better not to be too strict, otherwise the army could not go on at all. For this abnormal weariness, abnormal stimulants are needed. In Paris, we shall remedy all of this." End quote. He's basically saying there that the German army is on their last legs and they might need a break. So was Moltke's movement of troops away from the right wing what ultimately cost them the war? Maybe, but it might also be possible that he was just responding to adjustments that needed to be made to the game plan as he saw them. And sometimes these judgments and these communications that he makes with the people in charge can turn into miscommunications and misjudgments. Another theme here of the war in the early phase is these very miscommunications and misjudgments that I just mentioned. Historian G.J. Meyer talks about this, and he says, quote, "The technology of the day made this a laborious process, requiring much waiting for connections, much shouting into receivers, much uncertainty about what the faint and fuzzy voice on the other end of the line was saying." End quote. I think he's basically saying there that if the communications were a little bit better, a little bit more advanced, a little bit more clear, maybe some of those mistakes on the German end of things wouldn't have happened. This doesn't just go for the Germans, but it goes for all sides of the war, really, where you have leaders who aren't really good at communicating with each other. Communication is happening over long distances, and oftentimes you're not directly talking to the person giving you orders, so there can be all sorts of miscommunications that happen. For example, the British and the French don't see eye to eye. They aren't coordinating their efforts early on in 1914 as much as they probably should be. The British, John French and Haig on the continent, they are a little bit kind of in between a rock and a hard place, because that guy Kitchener, the kind of Secretary of Defense, he wants them to keep the army out of harm's way, whereas the French generals are saying, look, we need you to help out here, or otherwise we're going to lose the war. So this kind of communication issue can become a big thing. Another good example of this is something called the Battle of Tannenberg, which takes place on the Eastern Front in the early part of the war in 1914, and it's between the Russians and the Germans. Very early on in the war, the Russians were actually advancing much more quickly than the Germans thought, so there was kind of this request for more troops, which is why Moltke sent them over, but it turns out guys by the name of Hindenburg and Ludendorff would take command, and ultimately they would decide they could probably handle the situation without the additional help. Unfortunately, that message never got to Moltke, so he sent the troops anyway. But anyway, as far as this battle goes, the Russians have two armies kind of in the field here. One under a guy by the name of Rennenkampf, and the other under a guy by the name of Samsonov. And the story goes that one of the German military guys had actually, as he was observing some Russian battle from years ago, he witnessed a fist fight between them, and he knew that they hated each other. So the Germans kind of come up with this plan where if we can divide and conquer, if we can take out one quickly, it might be true that the other one might be reluctant to help since they don't like each other and because they're probably not communicating with each other as much as they could. And of course, there's stories about the Russian army mobilizing too fast anyway. Many troops are going into battle without shoes. Many troops are going into battle without guns, the basic necessities of war. The Russian armies would find themselves sort of inexplicably divided, and the communication between the two armies wouldn't be there. The Germans surround one of the armies, the army of Samsonov, who, by the way, would get himself surrounded, go into the woods, and shoot himself. It would be this huge, decisive victory for the Germans on the Eastern Front, and it would kind of set the tone for the rest of these battles on the Eastern Front. 250,000 Russian casualties, many in kind of mop-up duty as they were retreating, and only 37,000 for Germany. And that's crazy casualty numbers for the first couple weeks of the war, by the way. And it's kind of due to these mistakes and misjudgments made by the people in charge. Now, getting back to the Western Front, the Schlieffen Plan had failed for the most part. The Germans kind of had to retreat a little bit after the Battle of the Marne. The stage was kind of set to get entrenched, for lack of a better word, into trench warfare for the next couple of years. Both sides were now looking for a flank, maybe control of the port cities as things were kind of starting to settle into maybe what people were seeing as going to be a longer war. Both sides are now looking for a different area maybe to break through, and we get something in history that we call the Battle of Ypres, or some of these battles it's called Flanders, kind of northern France, western Belgium, and it's just some of the most devastating battles in all of world history. Here's a German soldier talking about it, and it's a really horrifying description. Quote, "During the first 2 days of the battle, I had only one piece of bread and no water. I spent the night in the rain without my overcoat. The rest of my kit was on the horses which had been left behind with the baggage and which cannot come up into the battle because as soon as you put your nose up from being behind cover, the bullets whistle. War is terrible. We are all hoping that a decisive battle will end the war." End quote. By this point, Falkenhayn had replaced Moltke, like we mentioned earlier, and both sides were settling in a little bit more for kind of the traditional style of battles that we start seeing in World War I, more kind of trench style with no man's land in the middle, as opposed to some of the more movement-filled operations that we saw in the beginning of the war. And this Battle of Ypres is a good example. The mud is horrible, the rain is horrible, it's cold, these troops are confused and don't really know what's going on in the grand scheme of the war. Everybody's looking for a breakthrough or a single punch that's going to win the war, and it's really indicative of the future tragedy that is to come. Here's a British soldier talking about this battle. Quote, "Grasping the firing handles and pressing my thumbs on the trigger lever, I fired without taking aim into the gray mass in front of us. Steam was now coming from the escape plug near the muzzle, as the water in the barrel casing began to reach boiling point. Belt after belt of cartridges went through her, till I began to think our ammunition supply must be getting low. Still those gray-clad figures came on. Hundreds of them, dead and wounded, lay out in no man's land. A fresh line leapt from their trenches and made a wild rush towards us, but were met with a withering fire. They got about halfway across, their officers urging them on, then wavered and stopped, and finished up by throwing themselves flat and sheltering behind their own dead. They found effective shelter behind this gruesome barricade, for the dead were piled 2 and 3 high. I played the gun on them, just skimming the barricade, but they did not attempt to come forward again. They lay there, not risking to expose themselves and not daring to return to their own trenches. We had a little breathing space now, the attack having died away to nothing. Whereas before the attack I had been shivering, I was now wet with perspiration. Our trench presented a terrible sight. Of the 12 machine gunners, only 5 of us were left." End quote. a lot of good stuff in that primary account there. And what's really horrifying in this trench warfare style of battle is, what do you do when you get caught in no man's land? There's a scene in All Quiet on the Western Front where the main character gets stuck in a crater hole, and he kind of has to deal with all the psychological torment that entails for a couple of days until he can kind of get rescued. And in that account we just heard, the shell hole, the crater hole, is a barricade of dead bodies. I mean, I can't even imagine how horrible that would be. Human mistakes and human misjudgments would fill this battle at Ypres, and there's examples of German troops nearly having the breakthrough they wanted, and there's actually nothing standing between them and the military objective that could potentially win the war, and all of a sudden they stop instead of continuing to advance because they think to themselves, how is it possible that we could be, advancing so easily here? It must be a trap. Different variations of that idea would happen all the time. Either leaders unknowingly ordering their men into slaughters, or leaders unknowingly ordering retreats when they could have advanced and greatly shortened the war. Because of this, and perhaps other factors as well, we now have trench warfare for the next couple of years on the Western Front. Here's how historian Barbara Tuchman describes it, quote, "Running from Switzerland to the Channel, like a gangrenous wound across French and Belgian territory, the trenches determined the war of position and attrition, the brutal, mud-filled, murderous insanity known as the Western Front that was to last for 4 more years." End quote. So this theme of trench warfare and the tragedy that was taking place and was going to continue to take place really starting to take hold here by the end of 1914. To really drive this home, I'm going to read from a section of G.J. Meyer's book, A World Undone, where he talks about some of these German reserves who get thrown into the battle at Ypres, and they're actually schoolboys, teenagers. So here it is, quote, "The devastating effectiveness of the British fire, coupled with the inexperience of some of the German reserves thrown into the Ypres meat grinder, led to perhaps the most poignant of the many butcheries of late 1914. Thousands of schoolboy recruits, many of them as young as 16, followed almost equally inexperienced reserve sergeants and officers in heavily massed formations directed at the waiting BEF. They formed a wall of flesh. British soldiers recalled them advancing arm in arm, singing as they came, wearing their fraternity caps and carrying flowers that blind men could hardly have missed. They were mowed down in rows. Where they somehow succeeded in driving back their enemies, they often didn't know what to do next, and so milled about aimlessly until hit with a counterattack. Many thousands of these youngsters lie in a single mass grave, a short distance north of Ypres. At the site is a sculpture, the figures of a pair of parents kneeling in grief, created after the war by the mother of one of them." End quote. Wow. That pretty much says it all about World War I right there. And it wasn't just the soldiers who took part in some of these horrible experiences. Civilians were now being dragged into conflicts. German atrocities in Belgium began the process of a losing war for propaganda, which ultimately led Britain and USA into the war. Civilians all across the Western Front were impacted, getting kicked off their farms, their lands, kicked off the roads. Many people became refugees fleeing to the UK or other countries. On the Eastern Front, atrocities were beginning to pop up on both sides, perhaps providing a little preview for the even worse horrors that would take place on the Eastern Front in World War II. Here's an English guy who finds himself amongst the Russian troops talking about these brutalities. Keep in mind he is English and with the Russians, so maybe take what he says with a grain of salt, but he says, quote, "The Cossack," talking about the Russians, "has a strong disinclination to be taken prisoner. and I knew of several of them sacrificing their lives rather than fall into the hands of the Germans, who heartily detest these men and usually murdered such as they succeeded in catching, and murdered them after preliminary tortures, according to reports which reached us. The country people certainly showed no mercy to stragglers falling into their hands. They usually pitchforked them to death, and this lethal weapon was a favorite with the ladies on both sides of the border, many a fine Teuton meeting his end by thrusts from this implement." End quote. It's stuff like this and the fact that there's so many hundreds of thousands of casualties going on that bring us to the next theme of the idea being that World War I became self-perpetuating. So there wouldn't be any talk of really serious talk of peace in these early years of the war, because after you've lost all of these people and after the cost has been so high, you're all of a sudden just going to say, oh, well, let's shake hands and end the war and we'll go back to the way things were. The stakes are too high for that now. So the war becomes self-justifying, and it becomes kind of a circular reasoning. Well, we have to keep throwing, soldiers and people into this war because we have to win it, because we've already spent so much and the cost has already been so high. And of course, that circular logic just makes the cost even worse and the war even more self-perpetuating. Here's how historian Barbara Tuchman ends her book, The Guns of August, on this note. It's actually the last paragraph of the book. Quote, "After the Marne, the war grew and spread until it drew in the nations of both hemispheres and entangled them in a pattern of world conflict no peace treaty could dissolve. The Battle of the Marne was one of the most decisive battles of the world, not because it determined that Germany would ultimately lose or the Allies would ultimately win, but because it determined that the war would go on. There was no looking back," Joffre told the soldiers on the eve. "Afterward, there was no turning back. The nations were caught in a trap made during the first 30 days out of battles that failed to be decisive, a trap from which there was, and has been, no exit." End quote. That trap had cost huge numbers of casualties in 1914. Just for example, Austria-Hungary, who we really haven't even talked about here, 200,000 dead, 700,000 wounded or prisoner in a few months of the war. Just crazy numbers. Their futile attacks against the Russians and against the Serbians effectively eliminate them as an offensive force for the rest of the war. The British sent about 160,000 troops into France. By the end of 1914, half of them would be dead or wounded. The general attitude of armies on all sides was something that Ferdinand Foch declared, and he said something along the lines of, "An army is never defeated until it believes itself to be defeated." So this kind of echoes with something that I think it was Hemingway wrote, that a man can be destroyed but not defeated. This is often interpreted to mean that you're not really beaten until you admit that you're beaten. So it's usually kind of like an inspirational type quote, kind of like a never give up type of thing, where, you can continually be destroyed and beaten down and oppressed, but until you personally admit that you're defeated, there's always a chance to fight back, and there's always a chance to be better. And I think that's what Hemingway intended when he wrote that. This idea of perseverance and never giving up. But you wonder if it would have been better for the world if during 1914, one side did give up.